The day my father died, I was in the hospital corridor staring at my father's retreating back as he moved towards the exit door, a sad smile on his face. The beeping machines gave their last message as my father took his last breath. I held his hand as he closed his eyes for the last time. He was 78 years old, a man who built an empire from nothing, and he left this world smiling. I was his only son, Birendra Singh, a retired army veteran who had laid his life at stake several times over in distant lands. But none of it had prepared me for what was in store. 3 days down the line, following my father's funeral, Sujata, my stepmother, called me to the house. She sat on my father's leather chair wearing his favorite silk sari as I took the paper. She was handing me from her shaking hands. My father hadn't left me anything, she said. Everything was to go to me, his beloved wife. The words were rehearsed, and I knew something was off the moment her lips touched the paper. His condition had been critical over the previous week, and he barely recognized anyone. It took me 3 days to come to terms with the fact that my father had changed his will. It was utterly preposterous that he would leave me nothing. He had told me so himself a mere 3 weeks ago, that he had gotten me something special. A bank, he had said. The old city branch. Their safety deposit, he added. I didn't take him seriously at the time, assuming the medications had addled his mind, but it wasn't the case. It was the last coherent thing he had said before his health took a turn for the worse. I only had his word, and I had no idea if there was anything there. But I was certain that Sujata had something to do with his change of heart. I spent a week rummaging through the clutter in my childhood room looking for something, anything. He might have left behind and found a brown receipt tucked inside a book of poetry he had read to me as a child. National Bank of India. It was dated nearly 20 years ago, and it showed that my father had a safety deposit box at their old city branch. If there was anything he had hidden from Sujata, it was likely to be found inside it. As fate would have it, I was right, but Sujata had beaten me to it. She was undoubtedly clever. Nothing was beneath her, not even the best lawyers in the city. I realized as the cold reality set in. She was confident and arrogant, a woman who had no fear of anyone or anything. But I was about to teach her a lesson that would live with her for the rest of my days. The bank's old city branch was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, flanked by derelict colonial buildings and bookstores owned by the same family since the early 20th century. I walked into the bank, clutching the worn-out receipt tightly in my hand, heart pounding in my chest as a pair of thick-rimmed glasses peered at the paper before sliding it back on the counter. "Might I have your identification, sir?" the man behind the desk asked as he glanced up at me. My pulse quickened as he disappeared into the depths of the building. It was 10 long minutes before he returned, a grim smile on his face. He told me that the box had been opened 2 days after my father's death. There was no need to guess who had done it. The woman was as transparent as glass. I had arrived too late, but that didn't deter me. If anything, it fueled the fire within me. one that had been building since the moment I first learned of my father's change of heart. Worse still, the bank manager hesitated before informing me that they kept a log of everyone who visited the safety deposit vault, complete with signatures. I would need a court order to obtain the documents, which is when it dawned on me that I would need help to get this resolved. I knew precisely who to approach. A woman notorious for taking on wealthy opponents in court. Advocate Mira Eire was a shrewd and precise fighter with a reputation for taking down arrogant families who thought they could walk all over the system with a few connections and a sizable wallet. She had a reputation for being straightforward with clients, giving them nothing but the bare essentials. Mira wasted no time getting to the point once I told her what had happened. "We will need medical records and bank logs," she said, her expression one of mild curiosity as she listened to my story. "That's all we need," I replied, surprised by how composed I sounded. It wasn't easy getting the hospital records, considering Sujata's influence. But I had one thing going for me that she didn't: patience. I spent hours in the hospital's waiting room every day, talking to everyone and anyone willing to listen. It was tedious work, but it eventually bore fruit when Mr. Gupta, the hospital administrator, agreed to hand me the records. He was a principled man who enjoyed seeing Sujata in trouble, and he took great pride in showing me his stack of documents. The most crucial piece of evidence was the date on the hospital discharge papers, which was the day my father's health had begun to decline. The records showed that he had been kept on heavy sedation following the incident. It was nearly a week before he could eat solid food or talk properly, let alone sign a legal document. I took the documents to Mira's office and handed them to her. "It's enough to take her to court," I said. Mira looked at the papers, her expression never changing as she said, "We need to bring this to the probate court." She warned me that this would be a drawn-out process, with Sujata doing everything she could to tarnish my reputation. Mira said she had no doubt that Sujata would use every resource at her disposal to make me look like a madman, but I was confident that she would fail. I had seen firsthand what happened when men and women chose power over principle, and knew the lengths to which people like Sujata would go to achieve their goals. Mira's warnings only served to strengthen my resolve. I had seen greed and betrayal in the eyes of countless enemies on distant battlefields. They, too, had believed that they were indestructible, only to be stopped by a single determined soldier. "Remember what you learned in the army," Mira reminded me as we prepared to take on Sujata and her army of lawyers. "Never let the enemy see you sweat." Our evidence was straightforward, but it was enough to shake Sujata's well-groomed image in court, and that was all we needed for now. The probate courtroom was a sterile chamber, with uncomfortable wooden benches lining the walls. It was a place where ordinary people came to discuss matters of great importance, leaving behind their differences as they sat in judgment of their own. Today, The room was filled with curious onlookers who watched as I sat next to Advocate Mira Iyer. My fingers curled into tight fists as I stared across the room at Sujata's stooped figure. Her mournful gaze was fixed on the judge, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy as she dabbed at them with a white handkerchief. She was playing the role of the grieving widow to a captivated audience, but I knew better. Sujata was a consummate actress who could put on any persona she wanted depending on the situation. Her lawyers were all expensively dressed and intimidating, but they lacked Mira's quiet strength and determination. When it was finally my turn to speak, I saw Advocate Eyer's lips move in a silent prayer. The first thing I want you to know is that my father had every intention of leaving me everything he owned, I said, watching the judge's face closely. He told me so himself shortly before he passed away. Sujata and her lawyers exchanged knowing looks when I described the conversation. I think it's best if you leave the details to me, Mira said as I prepared to continue. I can handle the rest. There was an audible gasp from the gallery as Mira delivered the next blow. My father was under the doctor's care when he passed away, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. He was in a deep coma and barely conscious. The courtroom fell silent as the judge stared at Sujata's defense team, his lips pressed into a tight line. It wasn't enough to shake Sujata's carefully crafted image, but it would do for now. On the third day of hearing, it was our turn to deliver what little evidence we had. Mira stood and began reading out the hospital documents, her voice barely above a whisper, before stopping to give a detailed account of the events that had transpired. My father's condition was deteriorating day by day until the day he passed away, she said, showing the judge the records. He was under constant medication and care before passing away. She paused before continuing, her eyes never leaving the judge's. It would seem that your honor has been misled. The courtroom was silent as the judge read through the documents, his face growing progressively more severe. If the deceased was under medication, who witnessed the signing of this will? He asked Sujata's counsel, his voice low and menacing. The room was quiet as they struggled to formulate an answer. I think it's time to call in our next witness, Mira said when it was finally her turn again. I was next in line, so I stepped up to the podium and gave a brief summary of what had happened. My father told me he had something special for me, I said, watching the judge's face closely. He mentioned a safety deposit box, but I didn't take it seriously at first. The courtroom was tense as I finished my testimony and requested that the court take action against the bank. Mira's voice rang out as she called for the bank manager. I request that the court order the bank to produce the documents my father placed in the safety deposit. Everyone turned to look at the bank manager as he slowly crossed the room, his arms laden with a metal box. He opened it on the judge's desk and removed a yellowed file before unlocking it with a key. The entire courtroom was silent as the judge read through the contents before clearing his throat and asking to hear from Sujata. The woman was visibly shaken as she stood, her hands gripping the edge of the bench as if she were about to faint. "My father knew what he was doing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The courtroom was hushed as the judge opened the document and scanned its contents. "This will was signed 20 years ago," he began, clearing his throat and adjusting his glasses. "It makes no mention of you, Sujata," he said, turning to look at her. "Everything belongs to Birendra Singh." A hushed murmur rippled through the courtroom as he continued reading aloud. "It appears that your husband has made several attempts to alter the will without your knowledge." Sujata turned white as the judge finished reading and asked him to look at the documents again. The man was visibly shaken when the bank manager handed them to him. "The contents of the will are authentic," he said finally. The judge closed the document and looked at the stunned faces in the room before asking to hear from the next witness. Mira stood and gave a detailed account of what had happened. "The documents indicate that Your Honor has been misled," she said. "The deceased had several conversations with Birendra Singh in the days leading up to his death, including one in which he disclosed the existence of a safety deposit box at the National Bank of India." The courtroom was silent as the judge stared at Sujata's expression, which had turned ashen. "It seems that Birendra Singh was the only one who knew of the will's existence," Mira continued. "It makes no mention of you, Mrs. Singh, except for a small allowance. I was next in line, and as I stepped up to the podium, the entire courtroom turned to look at me. My father has served this country, and I believe the least he could ask for is for me to inherit everything he built." I paused before continuing, watching the judge's face. "It seems that Sujata has managed to alter the will to favor herself," I said, my voice steady. "I asked the court to order the bank to produce the documents my father had placed in the safety deposit when he had first opened it 20 years ago." The courtroom was tense as the bank manager walked up to the podium and handed the documents to the judge. They were yellowed and brittle, but their meaning was clear. The judge looked up as he scanned their contents. "Everything belongs to Birendra Singh," he said, clearing his throat. "There is no mention of you, Sujata." His voice was quiet as he continued reading. "The deceased has stated in the letter that he had no intention of leaving anything to you." The judge was visibly stunned as he finished reading and looked up at Sujata. "What do you have to say for yourself?" he asked. Silence filled the courtroom as the woman's mouth twitched, her hands shaking as she looked around the room. "Liar!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. This time it was her lawyers who tried to convince the judge that I was lying, but he was unmoved. He ordered the new will to be declared invalid, and for Sujata's lawyers to take the documents back to the bank. Mira and I stood silently as the manager left the building. "Your Honor," Sujata said when he returned, his expression one of deep concern, "I believe you are being misled." The judge shook his head and ordered the court to be adjourned for the day. He summoned his secretary and instructed him to file a criminal case against Sujata for forgery and fraud. Her lawyers filed a request for leave to appeal as they left the courtroom, but it was denied. The judge ruled that the evidence was conclusive and that Sujata's forgery attempt had been a transparent lie designed to rob me of my father's inheritance. He sentenced her to several years in prison, ordering an investigation into her activities. I emerged from the courthouse a changed man, the weight of years lifting from my shoulders as Sujata was led away in chains, her expensive lawyers left to fend for themselves. She had lost everything that mattered: her wealth, her reputation, and most importantly, her freedom. Still, I felt no satisfaction as her tears stained her expensive clothes. My father's name had been cleared, and his legacy secured, which was all that mattered to me. I paid my respects to his grave that night, leaving the original will on his gravestone. I told him we had won, that I would never forgive Sujata for what she had done, and that I would never forget the lessons he had taught me. I slept soundly that night, for the first time in months, knowing the veteran had done his duty and that the enemy had been vanquished. But this time, the battlefield had been much closer to home. Moral of the story: greed may blind, but the truth shall always prevail. Never underestimate a soldier's loyalty to his family and father's memory.